Hey guys, hope you're ready for another super rousing lecture by me, your favorite teacher. We're going to start our unit on imperialism today. And imperialism, as this wonderful picture shows, is the fine art of conquering the world. We're going to talk about why the US may have wanted to conquer the world, or at least parts of the world. This is a limited but significant period of time in US history. So let's get into it. So let's start with America turning outward. We're looking out of the United States to other places where we might want to colonize, we might want to send Americans to live. We're going to talk about why. So, the first thing that happens is that two newspaper tycoons, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, you may have heard of those people before. They put in their newspapers things that glorify life abroad and talking about how wonderful it is and how, if you go to these places, there's no issues. It's green pastures and palm trees and sunshine and all of that. This type of journalism and these types of articles, especially headlines, come to be known as yellow journalism. And we're going to talk more about that in our next class. We're going to do an activity about yellow journalism. So other reasons why Americans start looking outward are foreign markets. We have more and more farmers growing things that they need to sell abroad. We have factories churning out manufactured goods and they need new places to sell them. In addition, there are religious reasons. Missionaries are looking for new souls to convert. This picture is of some of those souls who were converted by missionaries, like those who follow the teachings of Reverend Josiah Strong. He wrote a piece called Our Country, Its Possible Future and Its Present Crisis. And basically, he talks about how wonderful the Anglo-Saxon civilization is, so white people, of course, and how we need to put that greatness on other cultures. Um, Other people start interpreting the work of Charles Darwin and the idea of survival of the fittest to mean that the earth belongs to the strong and fit. So if you can take over, you should. There are military issues or military reasons for us looking abroad. We have a steel navy, so our ships start being made out of steel. We have all these wonderful ships, and they start looking overseas for ways to express our military might. So Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, he wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and he basically argues that we need to start sending our ships all across the world because if you can dominate the seas, then you can dominate the world. So those are military reasons. At the time, Secretary of State James Blaine pushed what's called the Big Sister policy. And so there's this wonderful little picture of Dora in a book called Big Sister Dora, because the idea of the Big Sister policy was that we need to look to Latin America. We need to look to the Latin American nations, get them to follow our lead, and open up their markets to American traders. If you come into next class, singing songs from Dora, your grade will suffer. In 1889, the first Pan American Conference was set up. So we're looking to other American places in especially Latin America, South America, to come up with trade agreements. So we're looking outward. It starts with money. Okay, we need new places to trade, but there are other reasons as well, as you've talked about in this slide. Now let's talk about Hawaii. So the United States is going to look to Hawaii as a potential place for us to colonize. We're not going to talk about everything that happens with Hawaii in this slide. We'll talk more about that later. But let me give you just a quick overview. So in 1820, the first Protestant missionaries arrive in Hawaii. So this goes back to that religious reason for imperialism. And after that point, Americans start looking at Hawaii as their own. We set up Pearl Harbor as a Navy base in 1887. So we'll obviously see that when we talk about World War II later. What ends up happening at the same time, though, is that European diseases are going to start wiping out about 5/6 of the native Hawaiian population. Think about what happens with Native Americans in the Americas when Europeans start coming there. About 90% of Native Americans get wiped out. So similar things happen in Hawaii. So the United States wants to set up sugar plantations, basically, and they need people to work them. So they start importing Asian laborers. By 1900, there are more Chinese and Japanese immigrants on the islands of Hawaii than there are native Hawaiians and white people. And that's all because Americans need people to work on sugar plantations. In 1890, McKinley, he gets a tariff passed. It raises tariffs on sugar imports. So that basically means that any sugar coming into the United States is going to have a tariff on it. So Americans say, well, let's annex Hawaii because we want to not have to pay as much for our sugar because sugar is delicious. This idea of annexing Hawaii is fought by the Queen of Hawaii at the time, and I'm going to attempt not to butcher her name, Queen Liliuokalani. She insists that Hawaiians should control the islands because, well, they're Hawaiian. She, in the end, is semi-successful. What happens is that white planters and military troops arrive. They start to support an uprising against the Queen to try to force her to let the U.S. annex the islands. An annexation treaty ends up getting sent to the Senate, but before the Senate could consider it, President Benjamin Harrison's term of office expires. President Grover Cleveland, in his second term, becomes president again, and he is a Democrat, and he withdraws the treaty to annex Hawaii. So it doesn't end up happening at this time, but we'll talk about that later, because eventually, as we know, we do annex Hawaii. Okay. All right. Things in Cuba. All right. So we've talked about why we're looking outward. We talked about what happens in the Pacific with Hawaii. So let's talk about Cuba now. In Cuba, the Cubans, the Cuban insurrectos, they start rising up against their Spanish rulers, and this starts in 1875, and here's a picture of what they looked like, their uniforms. But they basically are mad because sugar tariffs are crippling the sugar industry in Cuba. They're desperate because they're not surviving and thriving like they used to, because not as much sugar is being exported. And so they want to drive out the Spanish. Okay? Cuba was a Spanish colony. It had been controlled by the Spanish for hundreds of years. And so they start basically rebelling. And to do that, the insurrectos adopt what's called a scorched earth policy. They basically burn sugarcane fields, they burn sugar mills, they burn railroads, they basically try to destroy this entire industry to try to drive the Spanish out, to make the Spanish say, okay, fine. Well, Americans, not out of some gesture of goodwill, but because of money, we say we support the insurrectos. The Spanish need to get out. Now, really what we wanted was Cuba. This upheaval was costing the American companies millions of dollars because of sugar. There's no sugar coming out, not able to sell sugar. We basically need to control Cuba, to control the Gulf of Mexico, to control sugar. Okay? It has nothing to do with not wanting the Spanish in Cuba anymore. It has to do with money and our economic interest. So, Spanish general Valierno, I'm sure I butchered that, but his name is the Butcher. Schuyler arrives in 1896 in Cuba. This is a picture of him. And his goal is to crush the Insurrectos Rebellion. He puts the civilians into reconcentration camps to try to force them to give up. They start dying of diseases. American papers are going to pick up the story and they're going to turn it into fantastic headlines with the yellow journalism that we've talked about before of Hearst and Pulitzer, which I talked about in the first slide. We're going to talk more about next class. They both try to outdo the other with images of blood filling the streets. Okay, and you can see this picture of a journalist in this like hill full of bones and skulls. If you look closely, you can see the skulls and different bones. These things appear in the newspapers basically to try to get Americans to get behind the U.S. going in and taking over Cuba. Artist Frederick Remington, he is sent in to draw sketches, and that's actually a picture of him in that field. He's drawing sketches of the violence. Hearst tells him, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. So this is kind of leading up to what becomes the first media war, war that's kind of spurred on by these yellow journalism headlines in the media. On February 15th, 1898, the U.S. naval ship the Maine blows up in Havana Harbor. 260 American sailors are killed. The U.S. blames Spain. They claim that the Spanish blew up the ship on purpose. Spain claims it was an accident. We find out in 1976, after lots and lots of analysis, almost 100 years of analysis, in fact, that Spain was right. It was an accident, but, well, saying that it was an accident, it's not going to start a war, and it's not going to help us get Cuba. So, spurred on by yellow journalism, Americans start supporting going to war with Spain. And the slogan that comes out of this time period is, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. This is the opportunity the U.S. needs. McKinley doesn't want a war necessarily, but he wants Spain out of Cuba. So he sends a war message to Congress on April 11th, 1898, a few months after the Maine is exploded. Congress agrees with McKinley, and they declare war on Spain. They also pass the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment said that once the Cubans had overthrown Spain, they would be given their freedom. So not that the U.S. is going to colonize Cuba, but that we're going to give Cuba its freedom. They can become their own country, because we believe that that was in our economic interest more so than us staying in there. Okay, so we will talk next class more about these ideas of yellow journalism, which have kind of come through all of these slides. You will have a quiz, so you can use any notes that you've taken. If you need to rewatch the video, go for it. I will see you soon.